Hi, well, it's my pleasure to talk to you today, Michelle. I want to introduce you first, if that's all right. So I'll say that Michelle Fletcher is, well, I met you as a deputy director of the VCS project, which stands for Visual Commentary on Scripture. You're a research fellow as well for the Center for Arts and the Sacred at King's, which is King's College London. You have a resume a million miles long of writings and things that you've done, but some of the writings that are particularly interesting to me in terms of what we're talking about today are the writings where you talk about film. I mean, I know that your interests are biblical studies, visual art, and reception history, and I guess film fits into the reception history. Does it? Is that?
It does. And I just like anything that moves and has smiting in it. So I've written on Frankenstein films, Terminator films, anything that gets to really low ratings. Has it got under 4 on IMDb? Then I'm all over it, basically. But that's my thing.
Perfect, perfect. Well, those are the films that become cult classics later, of course, always the ones like that.
That's what we like to say. When I'm dead, everybody will think they're good films.
That's right. But it's also particularly about the use of the Bible in those films, right? Or somehow the relationship between biblical or scriptural texts and those films.
Exactly. And it's also about how we can use film to think about the Bible. So how seeing these stories play out in front of us, the kind of themes that come out in large grand narratives that play out on the screen, how that feeds into the way that we might interpret the Bible today. It can be quite eye-opening to look at something like the end of the world on film and ask what might appeal to a contemporary audience. And then actually when people are reading narratives about the end of the world in the Bible, are they bringing similar ideas to the text? Are they actually reading through similar lenses? Because these are the popular questions we have. Who gets included at the end of the world? Who makes it in? What matters? What sort of things might threaten us? How should we work together as humans? Do we care about animals and the wider ecosystem? Does the book of Revelation care about those things? So looking at the way, I probably look at them as a figure of 8 feeding into each other back and forward of how it helps us ask interesting questions about how we interpret text and what we bring to text and how it can help us look at the Bible text in a new way on film, if that makes sense.
No, I don't want to disrupt this wonderful thing that you just said, which you kind of covered the entire field in a beautiful way. I don't want to turn too far sideways, but I'm just going to say, is it possible, and have you thought about, have you studied the idea that people also read the Bible, like the film as Bible? In other words, in what ways people actually think that they're reading the Bible, but they're reading it through Aronofsky, reading it, through a lens of a movies that they've consumed.
Well, we all see things through what we've seen, and films are so powerful because they play out in front of us. Particularly if you can see them at the cinema, you can't press the stop button, which we do so much on our phones or if we're watching them at home. But the cinematic experience particularly allows that outpouring of a narrative on your mind, as original audiences would have done when they were listening to the Bible, often having it read out. The book of Revelation would probably be read out initially to crowds. So it allows people to really experience something in quite a potent way with music, with a collective atmosphere as well. We all look together in the cinema watching. So I think that helps us have these narratives become part of the way we can remember and recall. But what's also interesting is visual culture has always impacted the way that we see things. So when you're looking at the films, if you're looking at Aronofsky's Noah, Aronofsky is looking through the lens of Gustave Doré, and he's looking at the lens of other artistic inheritances that have come to be part of visual heritage. And when we go back to really early Bible and film, back in the silent cinema, one of the ways they got away with doing cinema to start off with was justifying that they were bringing the text to life. So that idea that they were sort of allowing people to see the Bible, and those scenes were often almost moving artworks or allowing things that were a little bit supernatural to be seen. So Mary's demons being cast out, for example, you could actually see it happening. So it had that sort of son et lumière way that it fills in the gaps that our minds think about, but you could see it happening. And artworks have always done that. We have a long history of visual culture, and it's very difficult to unsee something that you've seen.
Yeah.
So film allows us to fill in gaps and to see things. It is very difficult once you've seen Russell Crowe going around, not to think maybe Noah could be more attractive than my childhood colouring in books. So,
Yeah, Russell Crowe is certainly more buff than my childhood imagination.
Exactly. So it does really give us something, but I think it helps in many ways, and we can see it as, is Charlton Heston Moses? What problems are there with that bouffant haircut? Can we ever unsee seeing God as really having an electric shock with your hair? But we can also allow ourselves to enter into a narrative and to be moved by narrative in a way that we are in a 20th and 20th century medium. And that allows us to get on board with that idea of storytelling, collective narrative that I've talked about, things coming to life in your mind. People would have told stories to each other in the past. It's that sense of not just reading it to pore over it like we do in a post-Reformation, post-Enlightenment world, but allowing the story to keep telling in the way that Jewish Midrash, Genesis Rabbah, it's bringing it to life some more. It's always filling in the gaps. And film allows us, in our contemporary medium that moves us to experience narratives in that way. So I'm always really pro it, but I think it's because I'm a really visual person.
Well, so let me just, something that I've already learned from this conversation is that you're saying Hollywood is not, Hollywood or film overall, I'm using Hollywood as a shorthand for film, is not as new as some of us like to have thought. But in fact, it takes its place in a tradition that goes all the way back. It's turtles all the way down. It's sort of interpretation.
It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So to think that anything was invented, that they weren't, when they're trying to bring things to life on screen, and I mean the glory days of Hollywood, when we're talking a long time ago. My friends won't watch any black and white movies. I'm always like, but they're always like the ones that are the key ones that everything you see today, you're looking through the lenses of that, right? There's the levels of imitation of what happens today. If you're looking at a wave, can you unsee the wave that you see in Deep Impact taking out the two towers? Once you've seen it, film has a very palpable palimpsest. And so one of the examples I like to use with this is John Martin painted a painting in the 1800s of the fall of Babylon. And he's got a sort of Bruegel-esque tower. So he's already looking back to art from the 1600s. So he's got this idea of a tower that's a cone, and he's showing the whole of Babylon stretching out, falling, just about ready to fall, as Daniel gives this proclamation in Daniel 5. That scene and the architecture in that is actually borrowing from the English railway system at the time, at the edge of technology. Wow. So he's painting Isambard Kingdom Brunel's railway tunnels to make Babylon look so deep. That imagery is then used in D.W. Griffiths' Intolerance, which is for Babylon and different narratives that move through. You've got the Jesus story, you've got the fall of Babylon. He uses that to bring to life what Babylon could look like, bringing to life John Martin's painting. That architecture today exists if you go walking along Hollywood Boulevard and go to the shopping mall next to the Chinese theatre. That is based on Intolerance's set, and it has the elephants propping up the pillars. So what an amazing visual heritage that is of biblical cinema moving into commercial Hollywood Boulevard, which is going back to this 1800 picture, which is based on some biblical resonances, previous art, and English railway architecture. So it's great. It shows how everything's connected to everything else. Yeah,
it's a real soup, a real mix. And interpretation all the way down. So I mean, it's great that I've already learned from you about how film takes its place in that long continuum of interpretation. You mentioned already, you've mentioned Revelation twice. So let's step back for a second. And just because I love it, you have to slip it in all the time. Well, that's good. That's good. Let's step back and say, what is, just because not everyone watching is going to necessarily be conversant with these terms, what is apocalypse and what is eschatology, or, what are I know that slippery terms writ large, sort of what are they, and in pop culture, I mean. All right. So apocalypse is the opening word of the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Christian Testament, in Greek apocalypsis, and it has a background in uncovering and revealing. So some of the earliest uses of the verb apocalypto is a sense of revealing a severed head. It's like a surprise, here's your dad, but here's his head. Yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
Later on, it has this sense of hidden and revealing. So what Revelation is doing when it opens up with this word of apocalypsis is it's indicating that it is going to uncover and reveal something. It can be known as pulling back the veil. As we know, today, this is a really popular term. I always like the lipstick apocalypsis. That's a great one.
Is there such a thing?
There is, yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Rimmel's apocalypse.
Okay, wow.
Apocalypse. It's great. So it's become a word that has been associated with some of the key things that happen in the Book of Revelation. The first time it's actually used to describe a type of literature is that first use in the Book of Revelation. And it becomes known as this genre that people say are in the Book of Daniel, present in the Hebrew Bible, coming through into Second Temple Judaism texts, and then ending up in the New Testament. But actually that first use of the term is at the beginning of the Book of Revelation to describe something like this. Obviously, then apocalypse becomes this disaster, unveiling, destruction. And so when we have a sort of weather apocalypse, we know what it means. It means something really bad's going to happen. As they say in, which of the disaster films is it? I'm going to get it wrong now. I think it's Armageddon. The worst bits in the Bible. It has that sense of something really bad about to happen. So I think we use it today. Conrad Oswald describes disaster films as the secular apocalypse. It's that revealing of what are our underlying fears, our tensions, the narratives that do come to the fore at the end. And eschatology is what we think about with the end, the word eschaton meaning end, that study of ideas of ends. Now, ends can be terminal and they can move on into something else. So it can be that idea of the ending of one world and moving into another. In Judaism, we might say the passing of the current world, Olam Hazah, and moving into Olam Haba, the world that is to come. But it's got that sense of eschatology, of working towards this end point. And so a disaster film is a great way of thinking about that. If you think about the day after tomorrow, you've got that end point of the world is going to freeze in the north. As we know it, society today, the northern kingdoms are going to fall, and it is the south that rises because it has a warmer temperature. And so the world is changed forever. It goes completely crazy in a film like 2012, where the Earth's tectonic plates move around and you have the end of everything. The world is flooded in a Noachic way. They sail in arcs. Africa rises to be the highest place in the world, and they all go off there. So that's a contemporary way of thinking about the eschaton. We might think about eschatology as being a more personal thing as well. What is it in the end of our lives? What is an end point? What might we see as finishing one way of our world, our own life in another way happening? But they're the two ways to think about apocalypse, where it starts with this sort of unveiling, how it becomes part of our cultural vocabulary, and then that idea of end with eschatology. The other word that we might use for it being telos.
Right. Telos meaning the end. Telos meaning end. Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting that in a lot of disaster films, there's a small group or an individual who knows the truth about what's coming. And there's a kind of an apocalypsis there, and like an apocalypse.
Yeah, a revelation. Yeah.
A revelation.
So it depends what you want to do with disaster. So there are some key things that are seen. If you want to be a real purist on disaster genre, we were talking about apocalypse as a genre, and this has been studied by John Collins to try and determine what an apocalypse is, but disaster movies are far more interesting.
Yeah,
so Nick Roddick in 1980 decided to come up with some key facts that he said made something an actual disaster film. And this means that biblical films which have disaster elements in them don't always fit in. But if we might want to think about them, let me just go through some of the key factors for you. So the disaster is the central element. It's generally factually possible. It's unexpected, although perhaps predicted. So it is this sense that somebody knows it's going to happen. It's largely indiscriminate and all-encompassing, so everybody in the film is caught up in it. It's ahistorical, so it's not one specific social political factor that brought it about, which nuclear bomb cinema often is far more down that route. And generally they're set in the present day. So what's really interesting with these disaster-like films that are Bible films is that they're actually going back to an older form of disaster, which is the beginning of Hollywood again. So the disaster genre, as we know it today, grew up in the 1970s with the doyens like Airplane and Towering Inferno and the Poseidon Adventure. And that's sort of that eschatology when you're looking at a small group of people considering if some can live and some can die, what sacrifices should be made in a building. But Hollywood in its earlier days liked to look back to the past, the fall of Rome, the fall of Atlantis. Again, it's anything that's visually exciting that made the medium sell, that made people want to go and see it. And so you get a lot of historical disaster films, the Great Fire of Chicago, San Francisco earthquake, bringing things to life. And so the current day disaster films often are seen to be pure disaster when they're set in the present day. It's that future breaking into the now, which is very Revelation. It's very the book of Revelation, very apocalypse. John is on Patmos now and he's seeing an unveiling narrative. And it's a bit like that with Noah. Noah's living his life, doing his normal thing. And then all of a sudden we move into some really weird stuff. It's not his normal life.
Yeah.
So there is this idea that we're going back to what almost is historical disaster with this sense of it catches everybody out. It is often predicted, but everybody's not sat there waiting for it to happen. It's unexpected. And it fits a lot of those elements. So that is how we might want to think about the way that more recent movies such as Aronofsky's Noah in 2014, Gods and Kings by Ridley Scott had a lot of disaster elements in it. If you look at the film posters, what I wrote in my article, it's got some tornadoes in the background. Yeah. That's not what you see on a normal Bible film from the 1950s. The Sword and Sandal epics did not have that. That looks very much like the film posters of The Day After Tomorrow. Yeah. And the way that they're using the color palette is very much playing with Gladiator. Obviously, it's Ridley Scott, so you've got to expect it. But that sort of silver color palette that's in Noah. Noah's film posters look a lot like Ridley Scott's earlier film about a boat that got destroyed, and the name has now completely slipped my memory, but it doesn't matter. It's a film from the 1990s about a young group of guys on a boat that ends up in peril. And so the Noah movies, they're selling themselves in this, when people are going along to the cinema, the subliminal messages they were getting in the posters for these films are ones that are akin to what you're expecting in a disaster film. So it is selling the fact that they're going to serve up the worst bits of the Bible. Now, some of the reasons this might have happened.
Can I just interrupt for a second to say, to reinforce that, in fact, what you're saying, because for those who've already heard this somewhere else, that you're saying that there's the message that you get in the plot, but there's also the message that you get in the color palette you mentioned.
Absolutely. White Squall is the film, by the way.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, yeah, so I remember the posters for that. So there are messages that you get that may be subliminal in terms of music or color palette or other things that harken back to fonts.
So, fonts. So if you think about a Western font, you've got that playbill font that comes up. If you think of a Western poster, so that's known as playbill. So that gets used in the Western genre a lot. And if you go and see a romantic comedy, they've got that often blue lettering. There are lots of things that happen in marketing that sell things. When you see that poster flashing past, that give you some hints as to what sort of film this might be, which is why you can make a bit of a judgment call based on a poster. And sometimes if it doesn't do what you want it to do, you get a bit of a shock, right?
Disappointment.
Like, I signed up for the car movie and it's got a romance. So what am I doing? But there are lots of subliminal messaging with this. And so those more recent disaster Bible films are playing with the disaster poster. They were selling them. You're going to get to see men eaten by crocodiles. Who wouldn't want to see that?
Can you, I don't want to pull you off course, but I want to ask about the difference between a disaster film and a post-apocalyptic film.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you say something about that?
I can. So they are very different in the sense that the disasters already happened in a post-apocalyptic film. So the disaster film is about this, the term is diegetic. So the central story point is the disaster. So disaster film is always marching towards disaster. A disaster film is very odd if the disaster happens at the beginning and everybody's recovering from it. If you think about it, you're waiting for the really exciting thing that happens towards the end of will the world get destroyed. It's how will people cope with it? It does happen in some of them. The day after tomorrow, the world freezes, but the highlight is sort of the destruction. A post-apocalyptic film is one that's obviously set in the future because we haven't had the apocalypse yet. So it can break in to something that looks like now. But the world that you experience after that is the focus of the narrative. And in that film, it's more about rebuilding society rather than those anxieties of what happens when our current systems are tested and the questions we might ask, as I said, about who's in and who's out. The disaster film allows you to play those narratives out. The post-apocalyptic film asks, how might it look when everything's crumbled? What's left in the ashes? So Terminator being a post-apocalyptic film in that sense, and particularly Terminator Salvation, the fourth film, where they play out what it's like after Judgment Day. And interestingly, it got the worst reviews of that run of films because people wanted to see that sort of coming towards Judgment Day, that the other Terminator films, that there's that flash of what will happen.
Yeah.
Whereas when they showed that post-apocalyptic landscape, everybody found it really miserable. It didn't have the thrill that they wanted. So in your post-apocalyptic film, you're generally looking, it can have excitement. I mean, Will Smith being chased around by zombies, I think is quite exciting. But
legend. Yeah.
It's not going to be one generally that's necessarily aesthetically beautiful because you've got lots of let's make the best in the ashes. It's going to be one that is about human relationships on a small scale. Generally, you don't get those collective scenes that you get in disaster film because it doesn't have everybody in the film being caught up in it, in the sense that it's about the survivors. So you have smaller narratives playing out. Who can you trust? There's always the weirdo, right, that you end up thinking you'll be safe with them, but you're not.
And then they turn out to be a cannibal or something. That's it.
Yes, exactly. And they've
Yeah.
they've hoarded everything because they actually hoarded their dead wife in a cellar
Yeah.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've always got the weirdos. So it's those questions of trust, of survival, of food, of practicalities, of shelter, of populating the world potentially. The focus on that. And it's usually got a really dark edge to it, whereas the disaster film tends to try and work towards, at the end, the motif of rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
So there's usually some flash forward of something that can be seen to be good or a potential way of rebuilding what's fallen. And it's generally rebuilding it in the same way as we're used to. It's like, no, we can come back together again and make it the same. Maybe build better, but we'll still continue to build high. We won't think it was a bad idea. The post-apocalyptic film, it might offer some hope, but you're spending a lot of time in the ashes trying to figure out what's got lost, if that makes sense.
Right. This point about building back the way it was, as opposed to building better. One thing that I've talked about sometimes with my classes is that biblical apocalyptic, depending on what you're talking about, but there's this sort of there may be a utopian vision of a new world or a new order or something, but it's not brought about by one person, an American male, muscular male. And it is a different order from what you started with. Whereas in a lot of post-apocalyptic movies, or even maybe disaster films, I'm not sure, at the end of the movie, you wind up with New York, say, looking the way it did the next morning with nobody the wiser for the fact that the world almost ended. And that this is quite a difference from many of the biblical kinds of ideas of disaster or of societal disruption and change. Is that so?
I think it depends which film you're watching, how miserable it is, and what it might want to watch. So
Okay.
I recently I watched Children of Men recently from the early 2000s, is it? And I think at the end that offers, it was very poignant today, actually rewatching it, because at the end it has a woman who's pregnant on a boat floating around in the English Channel being picked up by a Greenpeace style boat going off to potential salvation. And actually looking at that today was a reordering of our political nightmare and tragedy in the UK with a bit of hope. And by seeing people that were trying to cross the channel to safety as potentially having a reason for it rather than the terrible things going on. I don't know how familiar your class are with this, but we've got issues in the UK narrative at the moment with small boats coming over from France. So that to me did cut through some of the narrative and re-envisage something in a new way. So I think that was really positive. They are a very, very broad group of film, the kind of post-apocalyptic. They're not as closed in a genre as that disaster movie where you can say 1970s this started, because you've got this whole idea of what does it mean, what is a disaster. So there's a film called The Deluge in the 1930s where New York is swept away at the beginning, and then they get put on a new island, and it's two men and one woman. Who wouldn't want to come up with that narrative in the 1930s? Who gets to have a, how are they going to repopulate the world?
Yeah.
It's that narrative.
Yep.
And the flood narrative at the beginning of The Deluge is reused for loads of other flood films in the future because the model was so successful. So you might call that a post-apocalyptic film in the sense of what's happening there. And that's quite a, that's more the utopian idea. When you go back to the 1600s, there's a utopia called the Isle of Pines, where a man ends up shipwrecked with the bread plant and has a very nice time with the leftover women who become very fecund.
Yeah, of course.
But there's always that sense in every utopia that there's a dystopic element. I mean, we see it in Plato's Republic. He has to get rid of the poets. Does he really want to? There's always that idea of whatever we're looking for and re-envisaging, someone's idea of glory is somebody's idea of the worst. And so there's that lovely tension in them of trying to rebuild a society. For one person is good and for somebody else it's bad.
Now, does that map on, oh, I'm sorry, does that map onto the biblical book of Revelation?
I think so, because I mean, the end of the New Jerusalem, not everybody makes it in, do they?
No.
Let's face it. So you've got the people who are inside the New Jerusalem, and you've got the people who are outside the New Jerusalem, and then you've got the people who are in the lake of fire. So if you're going to go from any sort of universalist, as in everybody's saved perspective of theology, definitely doesn't work in that sense. The idea that everybody's having a great time when they're becoming the doulos of God, the slave, literally, of God. It's often nicely translated as the servant of God, and they're going to have God's name written on their forehead and become a pillar in his temple. With narratives where we're reconsidering power relations, is it something that you want to see as a great idea? Stephen Moore has done fantastic work about the fact that Revelation does take to pieces the narrative of the Roman Empire at the time that it's talking against. It is a book saying against the Roman Empire, you're doing this, we don't like it, this is how it's going to look. But Revelation can't escape rebuilding using the narratives that it's got of the Roman Empire. It borrows the thing, it uses the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, an enormous amount to literally rebuild. It's taking a lot of its images from those texts and saying, I'm a bit like Ezekiel, I'm a bit like Jeremiah, but at the same time it's part of its culture. And so it is reinscribing some of the narratives of Rome, and Stephen Moore's article on this in his book on empire really shows that the Constantine version of Rome, where Christianity became the accepted religion of the empire, it was very easy for them to take Revelation on as a book and to like it quite a lot. So it had something in it that allowed a rich top-down power structure to colonize the book very, very quickly. So for all of its kicking against empire, a new empire was able to take it on and love it. So
yeah, which is historically was historically the case. So let me ask you, just because I promised I wasn't going to keep you very long, if what's something that you that comes out of your research on Bible and film, specifically on film? I know your research is bigger than that, but from your research on Bible,
it's the most interesting bit of my research.
Okay, well, what is something from your research on Bible and film that you wish everyone knew? I mean, in other words, you know, sort of what's something that you would really like, a message that you just wish that people could hear and learn and sort of imbibe?
I mean, I think I said it at the beginning, actually. A lot of my career has always been about representing the past. So I'm always interested in, when we see the past from a new perspective, how we review it. So if I watch a film again today, I'm a different person from when I watched it before. That can be a nostalgic idea, but nostalgia in and of itself is a reevaluating of place, of person, of situation. And so I've already said you can't unsee what you've already seen. And that, I think that's one of my key things, that my scholarship pushes is once you've seen it, if that gets messed with, the image that you've got established, that allows you to see the world differently, and it can be quite disconcerting. And that's what a lot of the Bible is doing, because the Bible is often rewriting a narrative of the past. It is a text which is intimately in dialogue with itself. We often call it intertextuality, but really it just means representing things for a new audience in a new way. But if you've got used to one story and you see a different story, if Arnold Schwarzenegger is a baddie for you because you grew up with the early Terminator, when he becomes a goodie in the 1990s, showing my age, it's a bit of a shock.
Yeah.
So it's that idea of what is it when something changes and we review the past again? What does it do for us? And the Bible is always playing with the past of Israel and how they're coming to terms with what's happened, whether it's invasion, it's always invasion, whether it's the destruction of the temple, whether it's the rebuilding of the temple. There's always that tension going on when we're reading the Bible. And our entering into filmic narratives and reviewing them and watching remakes, new versions of films, what do they do to us? Helps us to think about how it is when we're reading the Bible, that is dialoguing across so many time zones, so many different social and political environments, and using the same stories of Israel's past to speak to new generations each time.
Wow, thank you. That's great. I mean, I love the idea Revelation as a remake of Genesis. Or, I mean, parts of Revelation as a remake of Genesis. Yeah, and that also happens in film. Is there anything specific about the genre of film that you wish that everybody knew? Who is interested in film and Bible, I should say.
Just the film studies is a fantastic discipline in and of itself, I think I'd say. And the writers in film studies are brilliant. So never be afraid when you're doing your essays and your assignments to read a good article in Sight and Sound magazine, get the subscription to that from your university library if it's available, and have a look, because they write beautifully about film and they bring it to life. They'll tell you about the special effects, the audience, the way it's viewed. And always think about film. Film studies really focuses a lot on how you view a film and in what environment, as I've said before. So that idea of watching it in a cinema, think about film as a cinematic delivery, because that's what it is designed for in the first place. And yeah, consider film as a genre that has its own wonderful, exciting discipline that's well worth reading. So, and it is always beautifully accessible. They write so nicely.
Yeah. Thank you. You just mentioned a film as being an experience for a theater and in a group of people reacting, and of course that changes things too.
Huge.
I watched a movie one time in rural Norway, and it was a completely different experience that I had seen in Canada, and seeing it in English amongst native speakers was very different from seeing it from people who are not native speakers, and didn't share some of the cultural assumptions of the filmmakers in the same way. What about most of my students and yours imbibe film now in 15-second bursts? And that's a whole different genre again. And do you have any sort of words about where that might be leading?
I mean, film shorts has always been a thing.
Yeah.
You know, and a montage, what is a montage if it isn't bringing together a 15-second shorts to allow us to tell a story quickly? I think that it's the same. You want to bring the same principles as if you're reading a review in a newspaper versus an article in Sight and Sound versus a long journal article versus a monograph. They're different experiences. Sitting through Charlton Heston, the Ten Commandments, you know, you've sat through that.
Mm-hmm.
It's an experience that goes through your body, and you might actually feel you've sat for a period of time. So I think that versus the 15 seconds, it's a different genre, and it's doing something very different with your brain. It's very quick. How are they grabbing your attention? How are they finishing it? Have you managed to process anything? Can you do very artistic replay? If it's doing things, what sort of messages is it conveying within its 15 seconds? It's a bit more like a billboard poster. So it's asking questions of almost the 15-second burst, and what can you do with the soundbite in the same way that you might ask, what do you do over a 3-hour storytelling period? It's the book of Philemon versus Genesis.
Okay. Yeah,
They're
quite
very
different,
different.
and yet still in the scripture. Yep. Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I promised I
Pleasure.
wasn't going to keep you long, and we there were so many places there where we could go to a different onto a different subject that I hope at some point we get a chance to do that. Thank you so much, Michelle.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to close the recording here. Oh, actually, wait, hold on. I got to stop it here.